The night of Thanksgiving had arrived, casting a warm glow over the quiet suburb of West Allis, just outside Milwaukee. Every house on the street seemed to be brimming with joy. Windows steamed up from the heat of ovens working overtime, driveways packed with cars as families reunited, and laughter spilling from dining rooms where tables overflowed with turkey, stuffing, and sweet potatoes. But inside one house, tucked away at the end of a lonely street, there was no laughter, no warmth, just silence and the steady ticking of an old grandfather clock. Eleanor sat on her porch swing, wrapped in a heavy knitted shawl that had once belonged to her late husband. The frigid November air clung to her skin, but she barely noticed. She had grown used to the cold, both inside and out. Her bony fingers curled around a chipped porcelain teacup, the liquid inside long since gone cold. She watched the world around her as an outsider, an invisible figure in the shadows of happier lives. Across the street, the Dawson family had their curtains open, revealing a room bathed in golden light. A little girl, no older than 8, giggled as she sat at the dinner table, her father ruffling her hair playfully. Eleanor's throat tightened. It was the kind of moment she used to have, back when her house had been filled with the sounds of her own children's voices. Now, those voices had faded into distant memories. Her children, if she could even call them that anymore, had their own lives. Grown, busy, successful. Too successful, it seemed, to pick up a phone or visit unless they needed something. It had been nearly a year since her oldest son, Michael, last stopped by, and when he did, it was only to ask for a loan. He had promised to pay it back, of course, but just like the others, he had taken what he wanted and disappeared. Eleanor sighed, setting her teacup down on the porch railing. She had spent years building a family, pouring everything she had into her children. And now, she was just another old woman left behind, another forgotten name on a Christmas card list, if even that. Her eyes drifted to the sky, dark and endless, dotted with cold stars that felt just as distant as the people she once loved. A sharp gust of wind rattled the bare tree branches, and for a brief moment she considered going inside, locking the door, and sinking into her armchair to wait for sleep. But what was the difference? Whether inside or out, the loneliness was the same. Somewhere across town, in a part of Milwaukee that never saw Thanksgiving feasts or family gatherings, a different kind of loneliness festered. The St. Augustine Home for Children was a place where kids without families were supposed to find safety. But safety was a lie. Ezra knew that better than anyone. At 12 years old, he had already learned how to survive in a world that had no place for him. He had been shuffled between foster homes and shelters, each one promising something better, each one failing. Now, he and his little sister, Ivy, were trapped in this hellhole disguised as an orphanage. Dinner that night had been the usual: thin, watery soup with stale bread. Ezra had eaten quickly, keeping his head down, avoiding the gaze of Mrs. Callahan, the woman who ran the place with an iron fist. She was a tall, thin woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a temper that burned hotter than the cracked radiator in the dining hall. Ivy, only 8 years old, sat across from him, nibbling at her bread like a frightened rabbit. She still had hope, still believed in fairy tales where people cared and families found each other. Ezra had lost that belief a long time ago. That night, after an argument over a blanket, Ezra found himself yanked from his bed, Mrs. Callahan's long fingers digging into his arm like claws. "Ungrateful little brat," she hissed, dragging him down the dimly lit hallway. "Maybe a night in the basement will teach you some manners." The basement. The word alone sent a shiver down his spine. He heard Ivy crying, begging Mrs. Callahan to let him go, but the woman didn't even glance back. A moment later, the door slammed shut, and Ezra was swallowed by darkness. He sat on the cold concrete floor, knees drawn to his chest, his stomach a hollow pit of hunger and anger. The air smelled of mold and damp wood. The the silence thick except for the occasional scurrying of rats in the corners. This wasn't a home. It never had been. They couldn't stay here. He wouldn't let Ivy grow up in a place that treated them like this. So, when the orphanage grew quiet, when the footsteps above faded and the world outside seemed asleep, Ezra made a decision. He slipped back into the dormitory, shaking Ivy awake. "Pack your things," he whispered. "We're leaving." She blinked up at him, confused. "Where are we going?" Ezra hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Anywhere but here. They moved quickly, careful not to make a sound. Ivy stuffed a small sweater into a tattered old backpack, while Ezra grabbed a half-eaten granola bar from under his pillow. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. With one last glance at the door, Ezra took Ivy's hand, and together they stepped out into the freezing night. The city stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. The streets were empty, lined with flickering streetlights and forgotten buildings. A cold wind bit at their skin, but neither of them slowed down. They had no plan, no destination, just the desperate need to escape. And miles away, in her silent house, Eleanor sat alone, staring at the distant lights of her neighbors' homes, unaware that soon, fate would bring two lost souls to her doorstep. If you like interesting stories, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. And let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. Ezra and Ivy had been walking for what felt like hours, their small feet dragging across the icy pavement. The wind howled between the buildings, carrying with it the scent of damp asphalt and distant chimney smoke. Ezra kept his arm wrapped tightly around Ivy's shoulders, trying to shield her from the worst of the cold, but his own body was trembling just as much as hers. Neither of them had spoken in a while. There was nothing left to say. They had no plan, no destination, only the certainty that they couldn't go back. Ezra had seen too much, had felt the sting of Mrs. Callahan's punishments too many times to believe that anything would change. St. Augustine's wasn't a home. It never had been. A few cars passed on the nearly deserted street, their headlights illuminating the siblings for a brief moment before vanishing into the night. Every time Ezra heard an engine approach, his body tensed, expecting the worst. The orphanage had people, connections. If they realized they were gone, someone would come looking. He couldn't let that happen. Ivy coughed, a small, pitiful sound, and Ezra's stomach twisted. Her hands were red from the cold, her tiny fingers stiff. He pulled her closer, rubbing her arms, trying to create warmth where there was none. "We need to find somewhere to stop," she murmured, her voice weak. Ezra nodded. Just a little longer. The streets they walked were unfamiliar, lined with darkened storefronts and run-down apartment buildings. Here and there, neon signs flickered, advertising late-night diners, pawn shops and liquor stores. A few people wandered the sidewalks, some bundled in coats, others huddled in doorways, trying to escape the wind. Ezra knew better than to trust any of them. He had learned, over the years, that desperation made people dangerous. They passed a closed bakery, its window display filled with leftover pies from the holiday. Ivy slowed down, staring at the food, her breath fogging up the glass. Ezra felt his chest tighten. He knew the hunger gnawing at her stomach was the same one eating away at his. But stealing? No, not yet. He took her hand and gently pulled her away, ignoring the soft whimper that escaped her lips. They kept moving. Eventually, the city streets turned quieter, the noise of traffic fading behind them. The buildings changed, shifting from grey concrete to homes with front yards and porches. Some had Christmas decorations already set up, twinkling lights wrapped around railings, wreaths hanging from doors. It was a different world. a world of warmth and belonging, a world that had never been theirs. Ezra's legs ached. His body begged him to stop. But it wasn't until Ivy stumbled that he finally gave in. They needed help. He turned his head, scanning the street. Most houses were dark, their residents asleep or too caught up in their own Thanksgiving celebrations to notice two children wandering in the cold. Then he saw her, an old woman, sitting alone on a porch. Her house was larger than the others, a Victorian-style home with chipped paint and sagging steps. A single light glowed from inside, casting her shadow across the wooden planks. She was wrapped in a thick shawl, staring out at nothing, lost in thought. There was something about her posture, something distant, almost as if she were as lost as they were. Ezra hesitated. Ivy, however, didn't. Before he could stop her, she took a step forward. The wood creaked beneath her weight, and the sound must have startled the woman because she lifted her head, her eyes blinking as if waking from a dream. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then, in a small, hesitant voice, Ivy asked, "Are you okay, ma'am?" Eleanor frowned, as if the question had caught her off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had asked her that. She studied the children before her. The boy, tall for his age, his face tense with suspicion, kept a protective arm around the girl, his eyes flicking between Eleanor and the street behind him, as if ready to run. The girl, younger and more vulnerable, clutched an old backpack against her chest, her lips trembling. Something about them sent a strange ache through Eleanor's chest. They looked abandoned. She knew that look too well. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl, a lump forming in her throat. "I should be asking you the same thing," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "Where are your parents?" Ezra's jaw clenched. "We don't have any." The words came out sharper than intended, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She had spent a lifetime reading between the lines, and she recognized pain when she heard it. She glanced past them, toward the street. There was no car, no frantic adult searching for two lost children. They were alone, truly alone. Eleanor exhaled slowly, weighing her next words carefully. It wasn't safe for them to be out in this weather. They were cold, hungry. If she sent them away, where would they go? She looked at them again. The boy had shifted his stance, as if preparing for rejection. The girl, though hopeful, clutched at her brother's sleeve. Eleanor had spent years watching her own children walk away from her. She couldn't do the same to these two. "Would you like to come inside?" she asked. Ezra hesitated. "We're not looking for—" "Just for a little while," she interrupted. "You can warm up. Maybe have some tea." She saw the flicker of temptation in his eyes. He didn't want to trust her, but he was exhausted. He was hungry. Still, he hesitated. So Eleanor turned to Ivy instead. "Sweetheart, do you like hot chocolate?" The little girl's eyes widened. "With marshmallows?" A small smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. "With extra marshmallows." Ivy looked up at her brother, pleading silently. Ezra exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together, clearly battling himself. But in the end, hunger and exhaustion won. "Okay." Eleanor stepped aside, pushing the door open. The warmth of the house rushed out to meet them, and for the first time in a long time, Ezra allowed himself to step into the unknown. As the door closed behind them, Eleanor had no idea that she had just changed the course of all their lives forever. The warmth of the house wrapped around them like a thick blanket, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Ezra stood just beyond the threshold, his body tense, his senses alert. He had learned long ago that kindness was often a trick, a baited hook disguised as a helping hand. But Ivy, still clutching his sleeve, had already let herself relax. Eleanor shut the door gently, her movements slow, as if afraid to startle them. The entrance hall smelled of cinnamon and old wood. A soft lamp cast a golden glow over the worn furniture, and a staircase curved up toward a second floor. The house was large, but not in a grand way. Rather, it felt lived in, filled with echoes of a past that lingered in every corner. Eleanor turned toward them, noticing how Ezra's shoulders were still stiff, his eyes darting around as if memorizing every exit. The way he positioned himself slightly in front of Ivy, always protecting her, made her heart ache. "You can take off your coats," she said gently. "Warm up a little." Ezra hesitated. Ivy looked at him, waiting for his approval. Finally, he exhaled and shrugged off his thin jacket, revealing the too small sweater underneath. Ivy did the same, rubbing her hands together, her fingers still red from the cold. Eleanor took their coats and hung them near the radiator. "Come sit," she said, nodding toward the living room. The children followed cautiously. The living room was cozy, if a little outdated. A floral-patterned couch sat near the fireplace, which crackled softly, the embers glowing beneath the charred wood. Framed photographs lined a wooden mantel, old pictures of smiling children, younger versions of Eleanor with a man beside her. A life that no longer existed. Ezra's eyes flicked to the photos, then back to Eleanor. He was studying her, trying to piece together who she was, whether she could be trusted. She noticed. "You must be hungry," she said instead, choosing not to push. "Let me make you something." Ivy perked up at that, nodding quickly. Ezra hesitated before giving a small, reluctant nod. Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen. The house was silent except for the distant sounds of her preparing food, cabinets opening, the clinking of dishes. Ivy slowly sank into the couch, pulling her legs up beneath her. "It's warm," she whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly would make it disappear. Ezra remained standing. "We shouldn't get comfortable." Ivy frowned. "She seems nice." He said nothing. A few minutes later, Eleanor returned with a tray, 2 bowls of steaming soup, thick slices of bread, and, just as she had promised, mugs of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows. She set it down on the coffee table. "I hope this is okay," she said, stepping back. Ivy didn't hesitate. She picked up her spoon and took a careful sip of the soup. A soft sound escaped her, one of pure relief. She hadn't tasted real food in so long. Ezra, more cautious, picked up his spoon and stirred the soup slowly. It smelled rich, homemade, nothing like the watery gruel they had been served at St. Augustine's. His stomach growled. He took a small sip. It was good. Better than anything he had eaten in months. Eleanor sat in the chair across from them, watching quietly. She didn't ask questions, didn't push for details. She just let them eat. After a while, when their bowls were empty and the hot chocolate nearly gone, Ivy leaned back against the couch, a small smile on her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. Eleanor's heart squeezed. "You're welcome, sweetheart." A beat of silence stretched between them before she finally asked, "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Ezra's grip on his mug tightened. Ivy looked at him before glancing down at her hands. "We ran away." Eleanor nodded slowly. "From where?" Ezra's jaw clenched. "A place that shouldn't exist." His voice was sharper than before, edged with something raw. Eleanor didn't press. She simply folded her hands in her lap and said, "You don't have to tell me everything, but just know, you're safe here." Ezra met her gaze. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment, just quiet understanding. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time in a long time, He almost believed it. Eleanor watched as the children settled into the warmth of her home, though she could see that Ezra still hadn't allowed himself to relax. His posture remained rigid, his gaze flickering between her and the front door, as if preparing for the moment they'd have to run again. She understood that feeling all too well. Loneliness had a way of making a person constantly brace for disappointment. She picked up the empty bowls and cups, careful not to make too much noise. The last thing she wanted was to startle them. "I'll be right back," she said gently before disappearing into the kitchen. Ezra waited until she was out of sight before turning to Ivy. "We can't stay long," he whispered. Ivy frowned, hugging her knees to her chest. "But she's nice, Ezra." Ezra's hands curled into fists. "People act nice until they don't need you anymore." Ivy lowered her gaze, her fingers playing with the hem of her sweater. "She doesn't seem like that." Ezra sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He was exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached, his stomach still adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation of being full. He wanted to believe Ivy, that this woman, this house, could be different. But belief was dangerous. It was how you got hurt. Eleanor returned a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You too must be exhausted," she said. "Would you like to rest for a little while?" Ezra opened his mouth to refuse, but Ivy spoke first. "Yes, please." Eleanor smiled softly. "Come on, then." She led them up the staircase, each step creaking beneath their weight. The upstairs hallway smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Family portraits lined the walls, frozen moments of a life that was long gone. Eleanor stopped at a small bedroom, pushing the door open. "It's not much, but it's warm." The room was simple: faded floral wallpaper, a twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden dresser in the corner. It looked untouched, like it had been waiting for someone to return to it. Ezra stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning every detail. "This was my daughter's room," Eleanor said, her voice distant. "A long time ago." Ezra looked at her, searching her face for something: regret, sadness, nostalgia. He wasn't sure what he found, but it made his chest tighten. "Get some rest," Eleanor said, stepping back. "We can talk more in the morning." Ivy climbed onto the bed, curling up beneath the covers almost instantly. Ezra, however, remained standing. "Why are you helping us?" he asked suddenly. Eleanor studied him for a moment before answering. "Because no one should be alone." She turned, closing the door behind her, leaving Ezra standing in the dimly lit room, his thoughts louder than ever. Downstairs, Eleanor lingered in the hallway, her fingers grazing the edge of a picture frame. The image inside was old, slightly faded, but the memory it held was sharp. A little girl with golden curls, no older than 8, beaming at the camera while clinging to her mother's waist. That little girl had once been her world, and now she was just another ghost in this house. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat, turning away. Upstairs, 2 lost children were sleeping in her daughter's old bed, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel so empty. Her old station wagon rattled as it sped down the darkened back roads leading out of Milwaukee, the headlights slicing through the cold night. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, her heart pounding with a fear she hadn't felt in years. The sight of Ezra and Ivy in the back seat, huddled together, made her grip the wheel tighter. She had no doubt that those men, the ones in the black car, had seen Ezra through the window earlier, and if they had, they wouldn't just let it go. Beside her, the radio murmured with static before switching to a soft, crackling melody of an old country song. Eleanor barely heard it over the sound of her own thoughts. What had she done? She was harboring 2 runaway children. If someone found out, if the authorities got involved, They would take them away. Would she be arrested? Would Ezra and Ivy be sent back to that wretched place? No. She couldn't let that happen. "I don't see anyone following us," Ezra said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Eleanor glanced at him through the mirror. His face was hard, calculating, far too mature for a 12-year-old boy. He didn't trust anyone, not even her. And yet, he had gotten into her car. "They won't stop looking," he added, turning his gaze back to the window. "They'll come after us." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. Ivy was curled up against Ezra's side, gripping the straps of her backpack. Her small frame shook from either cold or fear, probably both. Eleanor's heart twisted. No child should have to live this way. "My friend Walter says his sister has a farm out in the country," she told them, keeping her voice as calm as possible. "She lives alone. No one will find you there." Ezra's expression didn't change. He remained silent, staring at the darkened landscape outside. Ivy, however, whispered, "Is it safe?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. It's safe." The words felt like a promise she wasn't sure she had the power to keep. They drove for another 20 minutes, leaving the familiar streets of Milwaukee behind. The city lights disappeared, replaced by long stretches of highway. Billboards advertising gas stations and cheap motels passed by in a blur. Eleanor's mind raced with every possible worst-case scenario. What if someone had seen them leave? What if the police were already looking for them? "Here!" Ezra's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He had taken off his jacket and was wrapping it around Ivy's shoulders. The sight of it nearly broke Eleanor in half. She reached out and turned up the heat. The train station came into view, a small, nearly abandoned platform surrounded by an empty parking lot. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting a pale yellow glow over the cracked pavement. The old station building stood at the edge of the platform, its windows fogged from the cold. Eleanor parked near the entrance and turned off the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. Then, Eleanor turned in her seat to face the children. "This train will take you to a town near the farm," she said. "Walter's sister, Martha, will be waiting for you when you arrive." Ezra looked at her, his face unreadable. "What about you?" Eleanor hesitated. She wanted to go with them. She wanted to make sure they were safe. But if she left now, it would raise suspicion. No one would believe an elderly woman traveling alone with 2 children wasn't running from something. She forced a small smile. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart." Ezra didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "There's some money in here. Not much, but enough if you need food." She placed it in Ezra's hands. His fingers curled around it slowly, as if the weight of what was happening had finally settled onto his shoulders. "Thank you," Ivy whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Come on. Let's get you on that train." She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tightly around her as the wind bit at her skin. Ezra and Ivy followed, their footsteps light against the pavement. Inside the station, the ticket counter was empty. A lone vending machine hummed in the corner, and an old wooden bench sat beneath a bulletin board covered in faded train schedules. The overhead speakers crackled, announcing the next train's arrival. A few passengers waited near the platform, an older man reading a newspaper, a woman with a suitcase, a young couple whispering to each other. None of them paid any attention to the 3 figures standing in the dim light. Eleanor turned to Ezra, her eyes searching his. "This is your chance," she said gently. "A new start." Ezra nodded, but the tension in his jaw remained. Then, the train arrived. Its brakes screeched against the rails, sending a burst of steam into the air. The doors slid open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Ivy looked up at Eleanor. "Will we see you again?" Eleanor felt something inside her crack. "I hope so, sweetheart." Ivy threw her arms around her. Eleanor held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, her warmth. She wanted to hold on forever, but she couldn't. Ezra hesitated. Then, in a moment that surprised even him, he stepped forward and hugged Eleanor, quick and awkward, but real. Eleanor closed her eyes, holding back tears. Then, just like that, they stepped onto the train. The doors slid shut. Eleanor stood on the platform, watching as the train pulled away, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Her heart ached, but she knew she had done the right thing. And yet, as she turned to leave, she felt a prickle of unease at the back of her neck. In the far corner of the station, near the shadowed entrance, a black car was parked, waiting. The train ride was long, the rhythmic hum of the tracks soothing yet filled with tension. Ezra sat stiffly by the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, even though the train car was nearly empty. Across from him, Ivy had curled up against the seat, her head resting on her backpack. Her breath was slow, deep. She had fallen asleep within minutes, the exhaustion finally overtaking her small frame. Ezra envied her ability to let go, even if just for a little while. He turned his attention back to the window, his fingers tapping anxiously against his knee. He thought about Eleanor, about how she had stayed behind, alone. He hated leaving her like that, but she had given him no choice. The train rocked gently as it passed through open fields, the city lights now just a distant memory. The further they traveled, the quieter the world became. Then, finally, the conductor's voice crackled through the speaker. "Next stop, Fox Hollow." Ezra nudged Ivy gently. "Wake up," he whispered. She stirred, blinking sleepily. "Are we there?" Ezra nodded. "Almost." They gathered their things, what little they had, and stood near the doors as the train began to slow. Outside, the station was barely more than a wooden platform, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. The doors hissed open, and Ezra stepped out first, immediately scanning the area. The cold was sharper here, the wind carrying the scent of pine trees and damp earth. There were no crowds, no city noises, just the distant rustling of trees in the night. Then, a voice called out, "You must be Ezra and Ivy." Ezra spun, instinctively pulling Ivy behind him. A woman stood near an old pickup truck, bundled in a thick coat. Her hair was silver, pulled back into a messy braid, and her face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that spoke of hard work rather than age. Her piercing eyes studied them, not unkindly, but with a sharpness that told Ezra she missed nothing. "I'm Martha," she said, stepping forward. "Eleanor sent me." Ezra didn't move at first. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, maybe someone softer, kinder. But Martha looked like someone who had never wasted time on pleasantries. "She told me you're cautious," she continued, her lips tugging into a small, knowing smirk. "Smart boy." Ezra still didn't answer. He didn't like this, being vulnerable, relying on people he didn't know. But he also knew they had nowhere else to go. Ivy, less skeptical, spoke first. "Eleanor said you have a farm." Martha nodded. "That's right. And it's far from here, far from anyone who'd come looking." That was enough for Ezra. He nodded once. "Let's go." Martha led them to the truck, the doors creaking loudly as they climbed inside. The seats were worn, cracked from years of sun exposure. The smell of hay and engine oil filled the cabin. As they pulled away from the station, Ezra kept his eyes on the road behind them, watching the train disappear into the distance. They were safe. For now. The drive to the farm was long, the roads winding deeper into the countryside. Ivy had fallen asleep again, her head resting against Ezra's shoulder. Martha, focused on the road, eventually spoke. "Eleanor told me a little about you too." Ezra didn't respond. "She said you ran away from a bad place." Still, silence. Martha glanced at him. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. I don't ask questions unless they need answering." Ezra finally looked at her, studying her face in the dim light of the dashboard. There was no judgment in her expression, no pity, just practicality. He nodded once. "Good." Martha smirked, turning her attention back to the road. "We'll get along just fine then." The farm came into view after another 20 minutes. It was larger than Ezra had expected. Wide, open fields stretching in every direction, a towering red barn standing against the night sky, and a modest farmhouse with warm yellow lights glowing from its windows. A few animals stirred in the distance, their silhouettes barely visible against the moonlight. As Martha parked the truck, Ezra gently shook Ivy awake. "We're here." She blinked groggily and yawned. "It's big," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Martha chuckled. "Come on. Let's get you inside before you freeze." The farmhouse was old but well kept. The moment they stepped inside, warmth wrapped around them, the scent of burning wood from a fireplace filling the air. The walls were lined with shelves full of books and framed photographs of people they didn't know. A large wooden table sat at the center of the room, and the kitchen, though small, looked welcoming. Martha dropped her coat onto a chair. "You'll sleep upstairs," she said, nodding toward the staircase. "There's an extra room. It's nothing fancy, but it'll keep you warm." Ivy, still half asleep, simply nodded. Ezra looked around, his muscles still tense, still waiting for something to go wrong. Martha noticed. "I know you're not used to trusting people," she said, crossing her arms. "But let me make one thing clear. No one's coming for you here. This farm is the last place anyone would think to look." Ezra held her gaze, searching for any sign of a lie. He found none. Finally, he exhaled, just slightly. Martha gestured toward the stairs. "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." Ezra nodded, then took Ivy's hand, leading her up to their room. As he closed the door behind them, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe, just a little, that they might actually be safe. Ezra wasn't used to silence. At St. Augustine's, there was always noise, doors slamming, kids crying, footsteps pacing outside his room at night. Even in the city, there had been the distant hum of cars, the occasional siren wailing in the background. But here, on Martha's farm, the silence stretched for miles. He didn't trust it. The morning had passed uneventfully. Martha had woken them up at sunrise, handing Ezra a flannel shirt and worn-out jeans that, despite being a little big, fit better than anything he had before. Ivy had been given a soft, knitted sweater, the kind Eleanor would have probably worn when she was younger. Breakfast had been a real meal: eggs, toast, bacon. The first bite had nearly made Ezra groan, but he forced himself to eat slowly, his instincts warning him not to act desperate. Martha had watched them carefully, speaking little, but when she did, it was always direct. "We work here," she had said simply. "No freeloaders." Ezra had nodded, more than willing to pull his weight. Ivy, of course, had been given no chores, just the freedom to explore. She had spent the afternoon wandering around the property, falling in love with a barn cat that had taken a liking to her. Ezra, on the other hand, had spent hours helping Martha stack firewood, fix a loose fence post, and learn the basics of taking care of the animals. For the first time in his life, he had felt useful. But that feeling wouldn't last. Something was coming. He felt it before it happened, an instinct buried deep inside him, the same one that had kept him alive for years. It started in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. Ezra was out near the barn, gathering tools for Martha, when he noticed it. A car. Not just any car. A black sedan, rolling slowly down the dirt road, kicking up dust as it approached. His heart stopped. He had seen that car before. Ezra dropped the tools, his body moving before his mind could catch up. He sprinted toward the house, his pulse thundering in his ears. "Martha!" he shouted as he burst through the door. She was at the kitchen table, cleaning her shotgun. She barely looked up. "I saw a car," Ezra panted. "A black one." Martha's hands stilled. For the first time since meeting her, he saw something flash in her expression, something sharp, dangerous. She set the shotgun down carefully. "Where?" "Coming up the road." Martha didn't ask any more questions. She stood, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Get Ivy." Ezra didn't hesitate. He ran up the stairs, his heart hammering. Ivy was sitting on the bed, braiding a strand of her hair. When she saw his face, she frowned. "Ezra? What's wrong?" "No time," he said, grabbing her hand. "We have to hide." Ivy's eyes widened. She didn't argue. Martha was already waiting for them at the back of the house. She led them toward the barn, moving quickly but not panicked. Ezra admired that about her. She was sharp, always in control. She opened a wooden hatch in the barn floor. "A cellar." "Inside," she ordered. Ezra helped Ivy climb down first before following. It smelled of hay and damp wood, the space just big enough for them to crouch. Martha knelt beside them, pulling the hatch shut, leaving only a thin sliver of light. Then, silence. The car's engine grew louder. Ezra clenched his fists, his breath shallow. He could hear the tires crunching against the gravel as the car came to a stop. A door opened. Then, voices. Men. "You sure this is the place?" one of them said. Ezra knew that voice. One of the orphanage staff. One of Mrs. Callahan's men. His stomach turned to ice. Another voice responded. "It's the only lead we've got." Ezra held his breath. Heavy footsteps approached the house. Then, knocking, loud, forceful. Martha's voice rang out, strong and firm. "Who the hell are you?" "Ma'am," the first man said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. "Sorry to bother you. We're looking for 2 kids, a boy and a girl. They ran away from a group home in Milwaukee. Have you seen them?" A long pause. Ezra prayed Martha wouldn't give them up. Then her voice came, cold as steel. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." Silence. Then the second man spoke. "Are you sure?" "The old woman they were staying with, Eleanor Parker, she's missing." Ezra's blood ran cold. Missing? His stomach twisted. What had they done to her? Ivy let out a tiny gasp, but Ezra clamped a hand over her mouth before she could make a sound. Above them, the conversation continued. "Well," Martha said, her tone bored, "I don't have any kids here, and I don't appreciate strangers showing up on my land uninvited." Another pause. Then, one of the men sighed. "All right, ma'am. If you see anything, let us know." Footsteps. The car door opened. The engine roared back to life. Ezra waited, his breath still caught in his throat. Then, slowly, the sound of the car faded into the distance. Martha didn't move right away. She waited, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Only when she was absolutely sure they were gone did she lift the hatch. Ezra sucked in a deep breath of fresh air, his heart still racing. "They're looking for Eleanor," he said, his voice shaking. "She's missing." Martha's jaw tightened. "I know." Ivy clung to Ezra's arm, her eyes filled with tears. "What do we do?" Martha exhaled, standing up. "We fight smart." Ezra looked up at her. "What do you mean?" Martha's eyes were sharp, filled with something fierce and unyielding. "We find out what happened to Eleanor," she said, "and we end this." If you're enjoying this story, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. The barn was quiet after the men left, but the silence felt heavier now. Ezra's pulse was still pounding in his ears, his mind racing with possibilities. Eleanor was missing. Not arrested. Not questioned. Missing. Something was very, very wrong. Martha stood in the open barn door, staring down the road where the black car had disappeared. Her expression was unreadable, but Ezra could tell she was thinking, calculating. Finally, she turned to him. "We need to move fast," she said. "Come with me." Ezra hesitated, glancing at Ivy. She was still holding onto his arm, her face pale, her lower lip trembling. She hadn't spoken since the men left. Martha crouched in front of her. "Listen to me, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I need you to stay inside the house, okay? Lock the doors. Don't answer for anyone but me or Ezra. Can you do that?" Ivy nodded weakly. Martha put a gentle hand on her cheek before standing up. "Let's go, Ezra." Ezra followed her out of the barn and toward the house. He expected her to grab the phone, call someone, Walter, maybe, or the police. But instead, she walked past it, heading straight for a cabinet in the living room. She pulled it open and reached inside. A thick, leather-bound book sat on the shelf, covered in dust. Martha grabbed it and flipped it open, revealing that it wasn't a book at all. It was a hollowed-out compartment. Inside, a black revolver rested on a bed of fabric. Ezra's stomach tightened. Martha picked up the gun, checked the cylinder, then tucked it into the waistband of her jeans. She looked up at him, her eyes unreadable. "Get in the truck." Ezra swallowed hard but didn't argue. The drive back to Milwaukee was tense. Martha barely spoke, her eyes locked on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ezra sat in the passenger seat, his knee bouncing anxiously. "What are we going to do?" he finally asked. Martha exhaled through her nose. "First, we find Walter." Ezra frowned. "Do you think he knows where Eleanor is?" Martha's jaw tightened. "If anyone can find her, it's him." They drove for nearly an hour, back toward the city, the warmth and safety of the farm fading behind them. Walter lived in a small, cluttered apartment above an old bookstore, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Martha parked the truck out back, then led Ezra up a narrow flight of stairs. She knocked twice. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door creaked open. Walter stood in the doorway, his thinning white hair sticking up in all directions, a pair of reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He looked them up and down, then sighed. "I figured I'd be seeing you soon." Martha pushed past him into the apartment. "Where is she, Walter?" Walter rubbed his temples. "She's gone, Martha. No one's seen her since yesterday." Ezra felt a lump form in his throat. Do you think those men did something to her? Walter's expression darkened. I don't know, kid, but I wouldn't put it past them. Martha crossed her arms. We need to find her. Fast. Walter sighed and walked to his desk, shuffling through a stack of papers. I made some calls. A lawyer I know told me there's been a lot of talk about St. Augustine's lately. Whispers about corruption, about kids disappearing. He glanced up at Ezra. That's why they want you back so badly. You know too much. Ezra's stomach turned. He had always known St. Augustine's was bad, but kids disappearing? What do we do? Ezra asked, his voice quieter now. Martha didn't hesitate. We fight. Ezra met her gaze. How? Martha looked at Walter. Get us a name. Someone high up in the system. Someone we can put pressure on. Walter nodded slowly. Give me a few hours. Martha turned to Ezra. And in the meantime, we're going back to that orphanage. Ezra's breath caught. Back. Martha nodded. If Eleanor's missing, that's where we start. Ezra clenched his fists. He had spent his whole life running, from foster homes, from St. Augustine's, from people who wanted to control him. But now he was ready to fight back. Ezra sat in the passenger seat of Martha's truck, staring out the window as they drove back toward Milwaukee. His heart pounded harder with each passing mile, a storm of emotions raging inside him. Fear, anger, determination. He had spent years trying to escape St. Augustine's. Now, he was willingly going back. But this time, he wouldn't be the one running. Martha drove in silence, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The gun she had taken from her cabinet was hidden under her coat, but Ezra knew it was there. He didn't know if she planned on using it, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Walter had stayed behind, digging through legal records and trying to uncover more about the orphanage's secrets. He had promised to call with any new information. But Martha wasn't the type to sit around and wait. They were going straight into the lion's den. As they neared the city, Ezra glanced at her. What if they recognize me? Martha didn't take her eyes off the road. They will. Ezra swallowed hard. But this time, she added, we're not playing by their rules. It was late afternoon by the time they reached St. Augustine's. The building looked the same, cold, lifeless, surrounded by an iron fence that made it feel more like a prison than a home. Ezra clenched his fists. He had spent years inside those walls, counting down the days until he could leave. Now, he was walking straight back in. Martha parked down the street, away from the security cameras. She turned to him. Follow my lead. Say nothing unless I tell you to. Ezra nodded. They stepped out of the truck and made their way toward the front doors. The air felt heavier, thick with the ghosts of the past. Every step Ezra took sent a shiver up his spine. Martha knocked once, hard. A few moments later, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, thin, with sharp features and eyes like ice. Mrs. Callahan. Her lips curled into a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Ezra, she said smoothly, as if greeting an old friend. We've been looking for you. Ezra didn't respond. Martha stepped forward. We need to talk. Mrs. Callahan's gaze flicked to Martha, taking in the older woman's worn jeans, the set of her shoulders, the way she carried herself like someone who didn't scare easily. And you are? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Someone who doesn't like what's been happening here, Martha said flatly. Now, are you going to let us in, or do I start making phone calls? For a moment, Mrs. Callahan's expression didn't change. Then, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said smoothly. "I insist." Ezra didn't want to step inside. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. But he forced himself forward, following Martha through the doorway. The air inside was thick with the scent of bleach and something else. Something rotten, like mold growing in places no one could see. Nothing had changed. The same dull-colored walls, the same flickering lights, the same suffocating silence. Martha glanced around, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Nice place." Mrs. Callahan smiled thinly. "We do our best." Martha folded her arms. "Where's Eleanor?" Something flickered across Mrs. Callahan's face, something dark and amused. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Ezra felt his body tense. He knew that look. He had seen it 100 times before, whenever she punished kids for things they didn't do. Lies. Martha tilted her head. "Funny. Because 2 men showed up at my farm this morning looking for these kids. And now, Eleanor is missing." Mrs. Callahan's smile didn't waver. "That's unfortunate." Ezra clenched his fists. His nails dug into his palms, but he forced himself to stay still. Martha stepped closer. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dangerously low. "I don't have time for games. Either you tell me where Eleanor is, or I'll make sure this entire place gets shut down." Mrs. Callahan chuckled. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Martha smirked. "By making one phone call." For the first time, something in Mrs. Callahan's expression shifted. Martha pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. "Walter is already digging through your records. If I don't walk out of here with answers, your little empire is going to crumble." Silence. Ezra could see it now, the tiny crack in Mrs. Callahan's confidence. She was hiding something. Finally, she sighed. Eleanor was taken in for questioning. Ezra's stomach dropped. Martha narrowed her eyes. "By who?" Mrs. Callahan shrugged. "The authorities, I assume." Ezra could feel the lie in her words. Martha exhaled sharply. "We're done here." She turned, grabbing Ezra's arm. But as they walked toward the door, Mrs. Callahan's voice rang out behind them. "You can run, Ezra." He froze. "But they'll find you." Ezra turned his head slightly, just enough to see her smirking. "They always do." Martha's grip on his arm tightened. "Don't listen to her," she muttered. Ezra clenched his jaw. He wouldn't. But the fear in his chest told him she might be right. Ezra sat in the passenger seat of Martha's truck, staring out the window as they drove back toward Milwaukee. His heart pounded harder with each passing mile, a storm of emotions raging inside him. Fear, anger, determination. He had spent years trying to escape St. Augustine's. Now, he was willingly going back. But this time, he wouldn't be the one running. Martha drove in silence, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The gun she had taken from her cabinet was hidden under her coat, but Ezra knew it was there. He didn't know if she planned on using it, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Walter had stayed behind, digging through legal records and trying to uncover more about the orphanage's secrets. He had promised to call with any new information. But Martha wasn't the type to sit around and wait. They were going straight into the lion's den. As they neared the city, Ezra glanced at her. "What if they recognize me?" Martha didn't take her eyes off the road. "They will." Ezra swallowed hard. "But this time," she added, "we're not playing by their rules." It was late afternoon by the time they reached St. Augustine's. The building looked the same, cold, lifeless, surrounded by an iron fence that made it feel more like a prison than a home. Ezra clenched his fists. He had spent years inside those walls, counting down the days until he could leave. Now, he was walking straight back in. Martha parked down the street, away from the security cameras. She turned to him. "Follow my lead. Say nothing unless I tell you to." Ezra nodded. They stepped out of the truck and made their way toward the front doors. The air felt heavier, thick with the ghosts of the past. Every step Ezra took sent a shiver up his spine. Martha knocked once, hard. A few moments later, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, thin, with sharp features and eyes like ice. Mrs. Callahan. Her lips curled into a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Ezra," she said smoothly, as if greeting an old friend. "We've been looking for you." Ezra didn't respond. Martha stepped forward. "We need to talk." Mrs. Callahan's gaze flicked to Martha, taking in the older woman's worn jeans, the set of her shoulders, the way she carried herself like someone who didn't scare easily. "And you are?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Someone who doesn't like what's been happening here," Martha said flatly. "Now, are you going to let us in, or do I start making phone calls?" For a moment, Mrs. Callahan's expression didn't change. Then, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said smoothly. "I insist." Ezra didn't want to step inside. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. But he forced himself forward, following Martha through the doorway. The air inside was thick with the scent of bleach and something else, something rotten, like mold growing in places no one could see. Nothing had changed. The same dull-colored walls, the same flickering lights, the same suffocating silence. Martha glanced around, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Nice place." Mrs. Callahan smiled thinly. "We do our best." Martha folded her arms. "Where's Eleanor?" Something flickered across Mrs. Callahan's face, something dark and amused. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Ezra felt his body tense. He knew that look. He had seen it 100 times before, whenever she punished kids for things they didn't do. Lies. Martha tilted her head. "Funny. Because 2 men showed up at my farm this morning looking for these kids. And now, Eleanor is missing." Mrs. Callahan's smile didn't waver. "That's unfortunate." Ezra clenched his fists. His nails dug into his palms, but he forced himself to stay still. Martha stepped closer. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dangerously low. "I don't have time for games. Either you tell me where Eleanor is, or I'll make sure this entire place gets shut down." Mrs. Callahan chuckled. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Martha smirked. "By making one phone call." For the first time, something in Mrs. Callahan's expression shifted. Martha pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. "Walter is already digging through your records. If I don't walk out of here with answers, your little empire is going to crumble." Silence. Ezra could see it now, the tiny crack in Mrs. Callahan's confidence. She was hiding something. Finally, she sighed. Eleanor was taken in for questioning. Ezra's stomach dropped. Martha narrowed her eyes. "By who?" Mrs. Callahan shrugged. "The authorities, I assume." Ezra could feel the lie in her words. Martha exhaled sharply. "We're done here." She turned, grabbing Ezra's arm. But as they walked toward the door, Mrs. Callahan's voice rang out behind them. "You can run, Ezra." He froze. "But they'll find you." Ezra turned his head slightly. just enough to see her smirking. They always do. Martha's grip on his arm tightened. Don't listen to her, she muttered. Ezra clenched his jaw. He wouldn't, but the fear in his chest told him she might be right. Let me know when you're ready for part 10. A new family and a new purpose. Você diz. Okay. Oh, chat GPT diz. 10. A new family and a new purpose. The drive back from St. Augustine's was silent. Ezra sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his mind spinning. Mrs. Callahan had lied. He knew it. Eleanor hadn't just been taken in for questioning. Something worse had happened to her, and if they didn't find her soon, she might never come back. Martha gripped the steering wheel tightly, her jaw set. She didn't speak, but Ezra could tell she was just as furious as he was. Ivy was waiting for them at the farmhouse when they arrived. The moment Ezra stepped through the door, she ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Are you okay?" Ezra nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, we're okay." Martha set her coat on the table, exhaling sharply. "We need to get Eleanor back." Walter had left a note on the counter. "Call me. Urgent." Martha grabbed the phone and dialed. Ezra watched as she paced the kitchen, listening. Then, suddenly, she stopped. "You found her." Ezra's breath caught. He stepped closer, straining to hear. Martha's eyes darkened. "Where?" A long pause. Then she muttered, "Son of a bitch." She hung up and turned to Ezra. They moved Eleanor to a private facility, one owned by the same people funding St. Augustine's. Ezra's stomach tightened. "Why?" Martha exhaled through her nose. "Because she helped you escape. They want to make sure she doesn't talk." Ivy clutched Ezra's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Martha looked at both of them. "We bring her home." The plan wasn't easy, but they didn't have a choice. Walter had pulled some strings, found out where Eleanor was being held. A so-called care center on the outskirts of Milwaukee, meant for people who were a danger to themselves. It was a lie, of course. They were keeping her quiet. Martha pulled the truck into the facility's parking lot late that night. Ezra's heart pounded as they stepped out. Ivy had begged to come, but Martha had left her with Walter. This was too dangerous. They had one chance. Martha adjusted her coat, giving Ezra a sharp look. "Follow me. Stay quiet." Ezra nodded. They walked through the front doors like they belonged there. Martha had borrowed a nurse's badge from an old friend, just enough to get them past the entrance. The building smelled of antiseptic and something stale. A tired-looking nurse barely glanced at them as they moved down the hall. Eleanor's room was at the end of the corridor. Martha knocked once. Silence. Then, the door opened. Eleanor stood there, her eyes widening in shock. "Martha!" Ezra pushed past her and threw his arms around her, burying his face in her sweater. "You're okay," he whispered. Eleanor held him tight, stroking his hair. "Oh, sweetheart, I was so worried." Martha cleared her throat. "We need to go. Now." Eleanor nodded. "They'll notice soon." As they turned to leave, a voice rang out behind them. "Going somewhere?" Ezra froze. Mrs. Callahan stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed. Ezra's heart pounded. Martha stepped forward. "We're taking her." Mrs. Callahan smirked. "You really think you'll get out of here?" Martha pulled out her gun. The smirk faded. "Try me." Silence. Then, a slow, careful step backward. Martha gestured to the door. Let's go. They moved quickly, exiting the building before anyone could stop them. Eleanor was weak, but she held on to Ezra as they made their way to the truck. Ezra turned back once, locking eyes with Mrs. Callahan through the glass doors. This wasn't over. But for now, they had won. Back at the farmhouse, Ivy ran into Eleanor's arms, sobbing. "I thought we lost you." Eleanor stroked her hair, whispering softly, "I'm here, my love. I'm here." Ezra watched them, his chest tight. For so long, he had believed family was something you were born into. But now he knew the truth. Family was the people who stayed, the ones who fought for you. And for the first time in his life, he had won. 1 year later, the courtroom was silent. Ezra sat beside Eleanor, his hands clenched together. Ivy sat on Eleanor's lap, kicking her feet anxiously. Martha was beside them, her face calm but unreadable. The judge cleared his throat. After reviewing the case and taking into account the testimony of both children, the court grants full legal guardianship of Ezra and Ivy to Eleanor Parker. Ezra let out a shaky breath. Eleanor squeezed his hand, tears filling her eyes. Ivy cheered, throwing her arms around Eleanor. For the first time in their lives, they had a real home. Ezra turned to Eleanor, his throat tight. "Does this mean you're really our mom now?" Eleanor cupped his face, smiling through her tears. "Sweetheart, I've been your mother since the moment you walked onto my porch." Ezra swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. Then, without thinking, he wrapped his arms around her. Eleanor held him tightly. No more running. No more fear. Just family. Just home. And if you liked this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. See you next time.